Hello viewers, and welcome to the latest installment of the LOTR LCG Progression Series, a production by Cardboard of the Rings, the bi-weekly podcast about the Lord of the Rings, the card game, which is a living card game by Fantasy Flight Games. With you as always, my name is Mitch, and with me is Matthew.
Hello.
This time we're going to be taking a look at our new hero card and the 9 new player cards included within the Road to Rivendell Adventure Pack. So Matthew, why don't you go ahead and start things off by introducing us to our latest hero.
The hero for this adventure pack is Dunadan with a threat cost of 10, 2 willpower, 1 attack strength, 2 defense strength, 4 hit points. He is a Noldor noble ranger, and he is the twin brother of Elrohir. So while Elrohir is in play, Dunadan gets +2 attack strength. He has a response. After Dunadan is declared as an attacker, pay 1 resource from his resource pool to ready him. I tend to prefer Dunadan a little bit more than his brother Elrohir, just because I feel like there are currently better defenders in the game. But for all intents and purposes, I think they are really, really close, like just a hair separating them in my eyes as far as how useful they are. But I just find myself using Dunadan's ability, his response, more than I do Elrohir's. You know, I think he's similar to Boromir in that he's sort of, like his brother, has sort of a natural built-in readying effect that doesn't mess with your threat levels. But you're definitely going to want to boost his attack, because attacking for 3, while it's nothing to sneeze at, if he's attacking for 4 and 5, maybe even 6, and he can attack multiple enemies per turn, that would be pretty fantastic.
I think both Dunadan and his brother Elrohir really excel in situations where players need to take advantage of a lot of different actions. So, having recently played through all the different Khazad-dûm scenarios, it's very common for players to find themselves swamped by a large number of relatively weak attacking enemies where they really want to avoid undefended attacks. So Elrohir can do a ton of defending for you, and of course there's no reason to play one of these heroes without the other. So after the defending is done, hopefully Dunadan can use any number of actions to kind of return fire upon the enemies. You mentioned that your preference is Dunadan, but myself, I tend to lean more toward Elrohir. So whereas Elrohir can do a little bit of defending, and then maybe he can do an attack with his additional action, Dunadan, while he still has a respectable 2 defense, he's not going to be able to ready himself after doing a defense. So I think he's much more limited in that capacity, but both of these brothers demonstrate supreme flexibility in being able to contribute a very solid amount of willpower to tactics or leadership, respectively.
I think the biggest drawback to both Dunadan and Elrohir is that you have to pay a resource from their pool to ready them, and perhaps it's more of a drawback on Dunadan, where resources seem to be a bit more strapped in the tactic sphere than some of the others. So if you're going to be using either of these guys, or both, I would definitely recommend a Horn of Gondor, or a Steward of Gondor, or some sort of resource acceleration to make sure that if you want to take advantage of their responses, that you have the resources available. Otherwise, in my experience, and I've used this pair quite a lot, their response doesn't get used very much, but I appreciate the flexibility when and if I can use it.
I think another important thing to take into consideration if you're playing the Noldor duo is that a little bit of the focus of the Dwarrowdelf cycle of adventure packs is this secrecy mechanic, and if you were to play a secrecy deck making use of both of these heroes, you're only going to be able to hit that secrecy threshold for your very first turn of the game. So if you're looking to take advantage of these characters, it might make a lot more sense to play a 2-player game where one player runs Dunadan, the other one runs Elrohir, and then their complementary heroes are maybe some low-threat characters like Frodo or Bifur. The only problem with that is that neither of these Noldor characters have the associated keyword that would be most useful for them. So Dunadan doesn't come into play with ranged, so unless you're able to take advantage of Dunedain Cash, he's not really going to be able to take advantage of that high number of actions to help any other player on the table. And likewise, Elrohir doesn't come into play with Sentinel, so unless you're going to be taking advantage of Dunedain's Signal, then he's not able to do as much as he otherwise might. They certainly are a little bit of a bargain in that so long as the other is in play, the combined sum of their attributes is 1 greater than their threat cost, but given that leadership and tactics don't have any kind of in-sphere threat reduction, I definitely don't think these are necessarily the most secrecy-friendly heroes.
I think my final thought on Eladan is just that I use the brothers a lot up until this very day. They are sitting right by me in one of the decks I have constructed, so I'm definitely looking forward to getting some use out of them in our playthrough videos.
Well, now that we've covered our new tactics hero, why don't we go ahead and delve into our leadership player cards, the first of which is Dunadan Wanderer, an ally with a cost of 5. He has 1 willpower, 2 attack, 2 defense, and 2 hit points. He has the traits Dunadan and Ranger, and the keywords Ranged, Sentinel, and Secrecy 3. So, the first thing that comes to mind in taking a look at this expensive new secrecy ally is that very high printed cost. In last adventure pack, we were introduced to a card called Taking Initiative, where you benefit from having fewer characters on the table and a lot of high cost allies and other cards in your deck. That high printed cost certainly increases the likelihood of a card like Taking Initiative being able to damage an enemy, potentially drawing you an extra couple of cards. But the only problem with this character is, without taking advantage of that secrecy threshold, this is an absolutely monumental cost for a rather lackluster character.
Yeah, it's funny that Taking Initiative was the first card that comes to your mind, Mitch, because the first card I thought of was Haldir, who also is ranged in Sentinel. Though our Dunadan Wanderer here has 1 less willpower and 1 less hit point than Haldir and costs 1 more resource. So I would say if you're one of the tens of people out there in the world that plays a secrecy deck, this is probably an auto-include, because if you're paying only 2, I think this would be a pretty darn good ally. Otherwise, as you just mentioned, if you aren't playing secrecy, I can't imagine why you would include this character in your deck unless you're trying to, or pre-errata, trying to do some Sigil Minor shenanigans or something like that. But otherwise, if you're just playing sort of a straightforward, conventional deck without a lot of tricks or resource manipulation or something, I think the cost of 5 for this hero is not great. We will start seeing the Ranger keyword, though, become a little bit more important as the game progresses. Not a whole lot of love yet for Dunadan, so opinions of this card may change in future expansions, but as of now, this guy, while I think it's cool and I really like the art, the cost is just too steep for any non-secrecy deck.
I think the biggest problem with this guy, apart from his nearly insurmountable cost, like you pointed out, is that his traits have no synergy whatsoever. So if you want to deal some cheaper ranged damage, maybe you're just going to take advantage of something like Silverlode Archer. If you're looking for a cheap defender, whereas leadership doesn't have any allies that come built in with Sentinel, maybe you're just better off in the first place taking advantage of a card like Dunadan's Signal, or even just running Aragorn himself. Just like you pointed out with Haldir, this is sort of a jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none type character, and whereas he is able to lend quite a bit of aid to other players on the table, it comes off as a little strange that this ally has those ranged and sentinel keywords, just because the secrecy player, given that they have fewer characters and fewer resources, is probably more likely to rely on the assistance of other players than to be giving out aid themselves.
You know, now that you say that, it makes me think of something, and it makes this character, I think, even better in a secrecy deck. Because you have to be below the threat threshold of 20, you're probably not having a whole lot of enemies engaging with you. So if the secrecy player is playing a bunch of allies, unless they're optionally engaging, they're probably not doing much. This is an ally that you can play and have your threat under 20 and all your buddies are getting the enemies, yet you can still help them out. Your allies aren't dead on arrival, so to speak. So I actually am going to disagree with you here, Mitch, and say that having the range and sentinel in the secrecy deck makes him a better ally because your buddies don't have to take the full brunt of the enemy attacks.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly valid point, and if players are doing maybe one conventional deck, one secrecy deck, that could certainly work out very well.
So let's take a look at our final leadership card of this adventure pack, and it might be worth the price of admission all by itself. It is Lure of Moria, a 3-cost event. Its action is simple. Ready all dwarf characters. I mean, fantastic. I could just leave my commentary there, I think, because it's just obviously a fantastic event. But I do have a few other thoughts. It's better in co-op, of course. Certainly it's great in solo play, and I'm sure it appears in a lot of solo decks. But if you're playing a 2, 3, or 4-player game with everyone playing dwarves or a healthy number of players playing dwarves, this is an absolute powerhouse. You can send a ton of people to the quest or defend with a ton of characters, and then they can all do something else later on in the round. The two sort of comparison cards for me are Grim Resolve, which is also a leadership event, but it costs 5. Now, it's true it readies all characters, and this only does dwarves. At least it's, with dwarves being by the end of the cycle, having such synergy, Lure of Moria is really a great card in comparison. The other comparison for me was Aelmund, who after he leaves play, you get to ready all Rohan characters. So he's much more restrictive in that sense, even though he also costs 3. But we're starting to see more and more readying effects of certain traits, whether it's dwarves, whether it's Rohan, or whatever. And so I think of all of the ready all characters, or all of a certain type of characters, I think that Lure of Moria is probably the most potent, given the synergy surrounding the dwarves.
Just like you said, I think this card is absolutely fantastic. The fact of the matter is, if players are running dwarves, they're going to have Dane Ironfoot on the table. He's a leadership hero, and his resources can be used to fund events just like this. Having just seen Khazad-dûm come out, it's extremely likely that players are going to be running a lot of different dwarf characters, especially considering that Dane is boosting not only willpower but also attack. Being able to commit a ton of characters to a lot of different actions is just fantastic, because dwarves not only excel at, say, questing, but they're also defensive and attacking powerhouses. We've seen cards like Durin's Song that boost multiple attributes of dwarves, so cards like this really boost the power of various enhancement effects that we've seen. While it is true that this only influences dwarf characters, there have been countless times when I've played this card and maybe been able to ready something like 10 or 15 characters, and maybe there are only 2 or 3 of those that aren't dwarves. We had seen a card called Ever Onward make its debut in Khazad-dûm, and that was similar in that it kind of allows characters to not have to worry so much about questing and just kind of hold a lot of characters back for dealing with combats. But this is so much better, because for the same cost, not only are you able to generate a tremendous amount of questing progress, because you can contribute all the characters you normally never would to the quest, like Dane Ironfoot, Gimli, and countless others, but then you're also given that opportunity to deal with combat. So instead of kind of slowing your game, you maintain that forward momentum, you plow through your active location, your current quest card, and you're able to deal with all the enemies coming off of the encounter deck. So in a dwarf deck, I think Lure of Moria is an absolute must-have. Let's transition into our tactics cards, the first of which is Rivendell Blade, an attachment for a cost of 1 that has the traits Item and Weapon, and it reads, attached to a Noldor or Sylvan character, restricted. When attached character attacks an enemy, that enemy gets -2 defense strength until the end of the phase. So, for an extremely cheap cost, this is nevertheless a powerful attachment that really boosters the offensive capability of both Noldor and Sylvan characters. Just like the hero of this adventure pack was Eladan, being able to take advantage of his multiple actions not only boosts his attack strength, but also transforms him into a very powerful attacker against almost any number of opponents.
Right. I think this card is very reminiscent of the Mirkwood Runner that we saw in the Return to Mirkwood Adventure Pack. When that ally is attacking alone, the defending enemy doesn't contribute its defense at all. This one simply reduces it by 2, but for most allies, that's enough. There are 14 Noldor characters in the game, and that's counting the R1 objective only once. From the first 2 quests of the Dwarrowdelf cycle. And then there's 8 Sylvan characters. So there's quite a lot of options, I think, for you to choose who to put this attachment on. But of course, I think it would be best on a character like Legolas from the core set, or even the core set Glorfindel, who has an attack of 3 and then now can reduce someone's attack by 2. And of course, as you mentioned, Mitch, this would be great on Eladan or Elro here. There are only 4 core set enemies that have a defense greater than 2. There's only 1 in Shadow of Mirkwood. There's 6 in Khazad Dûm, and there are 5 in the Dwarrowdelf cycle, and there's 2 in Massing on Osgiliath. So lots of numbers there, but all I'm trying to say is that there aren't that many enemies, at least at this point in the game, that have defense values of greater than 2. So this is a fantastic attachment that is in almost all of my tactics decks, provided I'm running Noldor or Sylvan.
I think really the only problem with this approach of using a more finesse-focused weapon than something with just brutish attack strength is that reducing defensive strength, just like you pointed out, reaches the point of diminishing returns much more quickly. So whereas an enemy like the Hill Troll has 3 defense strength, it does have a much greater pool of hit points. So if a character was able to, let's say, increase their attack strength by 4 with 2 copies of Dwarven Axe, as opposed to reducing the enemy's defense strength by 4, you're seeing a little bit better return on the attack strength bolstering effects. A little bit later in the game, we're going to be seeing some cards that allow you to take advantage of 0 defense strength enemies, and there are some very specific situations where being able to reduce the defensive strength of one enemy allows multiple players to benefit.
I think you're right that there's basically 2 ways to approach beefing up your characters. There's the brutish way, as you called it, which I would say are the dwarves, and then it's no surprise to me, anyway, at least thematically, that the elves would have a little bit more finesse. With that said, most of the attack boosting in the game so far is dwarf-centric. It's the Dwarven Axe, which gives +2 to a dwarven character, +1 to a regular character, a non-dwarf, I should say. And then there's the Dwarrowdelf Axe, which has to go on a dwarf. Yeah, there's the Dunadan marks, but there just aren't that many ways in this point of the game to permanently affect attacks. And so this is one way to sort of do it. And I think it's sort of neat that they're doing it in a way that's different than the dwarves. So, the only people who can benefit from +4 from Dwarven Axe are a dwarf. Now, granted, this is attached to a Noldor or a Sylvan, but they would only be getting +2 attacks if they had 2 Dwarven Axes on them. So it probably ends up being perhaps roughly equal.
Really, the last thing I have to say about Rivendell Blade is that in a recent article by Ian from Tales from the Cards, he went ahead and pointed out a couple very advanced applications. So these are pretty situational, kind of corner case uses of Rivendell Blade, but it nevertheless kind of gives you a glimpse at the versatility and power of a card like this and how it might become just so much more useful as our game continues to develop. So, the conventional use of Rivendell Blade is an enemy is engaged with you, you attack it, and its defense strength is lowered until the end of the phase. If that enemy survives, it would be very possible for you or another player to play a Light in the Dark to push that enemy into the staging area, which would allow a different player to take advantage of Dune here, being able to make a separate attack. So, he gets his attack strength bonus for attacking alone, and he's able to take advantage of that defense reduction until the end of the phase. Another use, if you don't have a lot of ranged characters in play, is one character does their normal attack with a Rivendell Blade, and then someone else plays sneak attack on a Son of Arnor, pulls that enemy into their engagement area, and then launches their own series of attacks, which, again, take advantage of that defense reduction. So, whereas those are very situational, and it's probably not very common that you're going to see applications like that, they certainly do happen, and as we continue seeing more and more development, things like that only become more and more probable.
So the final tactics card of this adventure pack is Hail of Stones. It's a 1-cost event with an action, exhaust X characters to deal X damage to an enemy in the staging area. I certainly think this is a nice event, but I'll have to admit that I have never played with it, and I'm not sure I've seen anyone use this card. The nice thing about this card, or I think perhaps its primary use, is killing an enemy before it engages with you. So if an enemy has a nasty effect when it engages with you, or just something that you're not going to be able to defend and kill at the same time, or in the same round, this is a way to deal with it. And of course, I think it combos beautifully with the card we just discussed earlier, Lure of Moria, or Grim Resolve, or maybe even Eomend, or something like that. If you're not able to kill the enemy outright, if it's going to stay in the staging area, perhaps you can soften it up enough for, once again, Dune here to maybe finish the job. So it's one of those events where I'm not sure if it's going to make an appearance in our progression series or not, but it's definitely one of those I'm giving it sort of a second look and thinking about maybe how I could get it to work in a deck.
So just like you pointed out, I think the primary use of a card like this is dealing with enemies before they come out and engage with players or provide some sort of aversive effects. An enemy comes to mind like Orc Drummer. While it's sitting there in the staging area, it bolsters the threat value of all enemies in play by the number of players in the game. So whereas a hero like Thalon is very powerful in that it helps contribute 1 damage to all enemies, so it makes a hail of stones all the easier to end up killing an enemy. If players don't have an effect like that to rely on, there are countless low hit point enemies that you can exhaust a single character to deal with. If you're dealing with enemies that have a very high defense value, direct damage circumvents that entirely. So against a foe like the Mitch-King, you're able to exhaust any number of characters to put a huge chunk of damage on that enemy without having to deal with that 6 defense strength value.
One thing that I think is worth mentioning about this card, because the language is less than ideal or less than clear, in that you might think you could exhaust in a 4-player game everyone's characters to do a bazillion damage to an enemy in the staging area. However, according to the rulebook on page 25, costs can only be paid with cards or resources that a player controls. So whoever is playing Hail of Stones, they have to exhaust their own characters. I think they probably should have included that verbiage in this particular card just to clarify it, but they didn't. But that is, I think, worth noting for Hail of Stones.
So, specifically because of that rule you mentioned, 2 characters that work very well with Hail of Stones to increase the number of allies that one character controls are both Wandering Took and, as we're about to talk about it, Rider of the Mark. So, taking a look at the first of our new spirit cards in this adventure pack, we have this ally, Rider of the Mark, which for a cost of 3 has 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points, and the Rohan trait. It reads, action, spend 1 spirit resource to give control of Rider of the Mark to another player, with a limit once per round, and response, after Rider of the Mark changes control, discard a shadow card dealt to an enemy you are engaged with. So this kind of allows one player to have this Rider of the Mark charge to the rescue when an enemy is attacking another player. So he shows up on the scene, that shadow card gets discarded, and hopefully that player is either able to defend with Rider of the Mark or any other character.
Right, I always like to comment on the theme when a card jumps out at me, and this one I just picture, little horse galloping across the table to distribute Rider of the Mark from player to player, and I just think it's such a cool effect, even though, again, this is another card I don't think I've ever played with, and I think it's certainly worth mentioning that if the player you send Rider of the Mark to isn't a spirit player, then it's a one-way trip, so you want to plan that carefully. Otherwise, I think this is a very nice workaround if you don't have Hasty Stroke, or as Mitch just mentioned, if the other player is in desperate need of an additional attacker or blocker. The card that came to my mind for sort of the first comparison was Dunadan Wanderer, which came out in the Dead Marshes Adventure Pack. So you have to discard the Dunadan Wanderer from play to cancel the shadow effects of a card just triggered. So that's a little more reactive when you know what the shadow effect is. This is a little bit different because you don't know, unless you're scrying the encounter deck, whether or not the shadow card actually has a shadow effect. But it's similar enough in I think it's their responses here for the same exact cost. I definitely think it's a really cool card. I like the 2 willpower. This is another card that I'm hoping will make an appearance in our playthrough videos.
So it's definitely interesting seeing another Rohan character finally, so if you're used to relying on effects throughout the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle like Astonishing Speed for a good questing boost, this 2 willpower character is certainly eligible. Just like when we were talking about Hail of Stones, there are a couple different cases where you want one player to control a lot of different characters. So maybe you're running effects like For Gondor, and you're boosting up his relatively marginal attack value into something that nevertheless helps contribute to overcome some sort of nasty adversary. Overall, he does have pretty weak attributes when it comes to attacking and defending. His ability can certainly be expensive, but if you've got 2 spirit players or somebody running a Song of Travel, you can certainly bounce him back and forth to have reliable shadow cancellation if you either run out of hasty strokes or you don't have that to rely on. But, given the fact that Rider of the Mark can be pretty expensive, he's nevertheless a very functional ally, and I think what I like the most about him is he does not have to be ready to use his action, so you can commit him to the quest knowing that should you need to, you can toss control of him to another player.
An interesting use that just popped into mind, probably because our Amassing an Osgiliath video isn't too far behind us, is when you're on the quest stage Anduin Crossing, which I believe is the 3rd quest card. It says, in order to commit characters to a quest, a player must first choose a hero or 1 Ranger of Athelion card he controls. Discard each chosen card from play. So you're either losing a hero or a Ranger. So if there's only 1 Ranger in play, or you have to discard a hero, probably don't want both or all players doing that, so you could send this guy over to the player who discarded a hero or a ranger just to boost up their willpower by 2, so this guy can certainly soften the blow from having to discard a hero or ranger and really maximize the amount of willpower you're sending to that 3rd quest stage.
Sure, just like we took advantage of Faramir in that situation, not only would Rider of the Mark himself be contributing good questing value, but he'd also be benefiting from Faramir's action to boot. Really, the final use of Rider of the Mark that comes to mind right now is dealing with a lot of warg enemies, so whether in the core set or dealing with mountain wargs throughout the Dwarrowdelf cycle, these are enemies where if they reveal a shadow card that has no effect, they return to the staging area. So if they don't have a shadow card to reveal, that effect is never triggered, and they can at least sit there so that you can finally deal with them.
Alright, so our final spirit card of the adventure pack is Song of Erendil. It's an attachment. It costs 1, it's a song, and it must attach to a spirit hero. Response, after Song of Erendil enters play, draw a card. And then its second response reads, after another player raises his threat, raise your threat by 1 to reduce that player's threat by 1. So certainly, again, as Mitch mentioned earlier, the running theme or the running mechanic through the Dwarrowdelf cycle is secrecy. I think this is certainly nice for that. If one player is playing secrecy and the other is not, this is a way for the non-secrecy player to help their buddy stay below that 20 threat threshold. But even if one player isn't playing secrecy, this could help another player, probably the non-spirit player, stay under a particular engagement threshold. If there's an enemy like a troll or something you're trying to ward off for another turn or 2, this could certainly help. I think this card would combo nicely with another spirit card from the Dead Marshes adventure pack, Elfhelm, because his response is, after your threat is raised as the result of questing unsuccessfully or by an encounter or quest card effect, reduce your threat by 1. This could be another way to reduce your threat additionally or something. So it's not a card that I've seen used a whole lot. I think I've seen it used, the only time was in a video that Cardboard of the Rings did with Brandon and Brian. But outside of that very entertaining video, haven't seen this used too much, but it's certainly an interesting attachment.
So this is a very interesting card. It's got a pretty affordable cost at 1. I like that as soon as it enters play, it essentially replaces itself in your hand, and it allows characters to kind of manipulate their threat values. Just like you pointed out, you can maybe avoid engaging with a certain enemy, there are also a host of different encounter card effects that you can avoid if you control your threat. So I'm thinking of Evil Storm, where you want to remain below 35 so that you don't deal 1 damage to all of your characters. There are a number of other cards that cause you to do things like discarding a card if your threat value has reached a certain level. I think this is certainly good for allowing one player to tank the majority of enemies, but I also think it has a very clever use in that if 2 players are running Spirit or 1 player has Song of Travel, if 2 of these are in play, characters can bounce a Wandering Took back and forth between themselves in order to essentially manipulate their threat to whatever level they'd like it to be. So maybe during each planning phase, when those players are playing their cards for the turn, they can each make sure that they reach that secrecy threshold, just because player 1 can reduce their threat by 3 to grant control of Wandering Took to another player, so that player boosts their threat by 3, and because that second player raised their threat, the original player can raise their own threat by 1 to drop that player's threat by 1. They can return control of the Wandering Took, and there's been that net shift of 1 threat. The players can continue doing that, and so long as they never hit 50 threats, they can just do it as much as necessary to reach that secrecy threshold or reach whatever value you could possibly want. So, whereas this definitely requires a little bit of setup and does have that restriction of only spirit heroes, I think that situationally this can be an extremely powerful card.
Yep, I think that combo made my head hurt, so the only other thing that I have to mention about this card is that it is indeed a song. So we shouldn't forget that our lovely Rivendell minstrel can search for this card in your deck if it is a key strategy for you and your partners.
Really, the last use of Song of Erendil that comes to mind is the hero Boromir. So if one player wants to use just a ton of actions with that hero, each and every time that he or her raises their threats, the player with Song of Erendil can kind of tank that threat gain instead. So maybe it allows you to deal with even more enemies, maybe it allows you to deal with any number of other effects, but it can certainly help to kind of share the load. So, on to our lore cards, the first of which is a unique ally named Bombur, which for a cost of 3 has 0 willpower, 0 attack, 1 defense strength, and 3 hit points. It has the dwarf trait and action. Exhaust Bombur to choose a location. That location gets -1 threat until the end of the phase. However, that location does not contribute its threat instead if it is an underground location. So, automatically this is a card where you really need to do a little bit of scenario analysis before you bother playing it. So if you're playing any of the Khazad-dûm quests, it's very likely that you're going to encounter underground locations, whereas the first few adventures of the Dwarrowdelf cycle, there really aren't any to speak of.
You know, I don't have that much love for this version of Bombur. My notes to myself are horrid stats, meager with Dane. Dane, of course, would bump up his willpower to 1 and his attack strength to 1, but even still, it's a bit expensive, and his cost is quite expensive. His ability to me is similar to Secret Paths, which is an event that only costs 1. And you don't have to exhaust a character to reap that benefit, and it negates the entire threat of a location. So frankly, as much as Bombur's sort of a fun, silly character in The Hobbit, I think his first iteration in the Lord of the Rings, the card game, is a total dud.
I think under most circumstances the major problem I have with Bombur is, given his ability, he's only exhausting to contribute the equivalent of 1 willpower to the quest, and that's if you have a location in play. If you're running Dane, he's only contributing 1 willpower, whereas for the cost of 1, an Erebor Record Keeper at that point is already twice as effective. In certain situations, however, he automatically becomes solid gold. For example, the nasty underground location Sigil Mineshaft, which is contributing 5 threat against the players, so long as you don't exhaust Bombur to commit him to the quest or use his ability on some dark location or a mountain location. He's able to reduce that 5 value to 0, and if you are running effects like Erebor Record Keeper, let's say they're perhaps still ready because of something like Lure from Moria, or you simply didn't exhaust them in the first place, you can ready Bombur to almost act like a little bit of a repeatable Secret Paths. So, in some cases, you're going to be able to allow really nasty situations to just kind of sit there indefinitely in the staging area. Maybe you're avoiding travel or win active effects, but Bombur is definitely a very situational character that can be absolutely godly or an absolute waste of space in your deck.
Alright, so let's take a look at our final lore card of the Adventure Pack, Out of the Wild. It's a 3-cost event with Secrecy 2, Action, search the top 5 cards of the encounter deck for any one non-objective card worth no victory points and add it to your victory display. Shuffle the encounter deck. I think that this is certainly a nice way to get rid of some horrid encounter card that you just don't want to deal with, or don't want to use cancellation for if it is cancelable. And I think this card might even be worth the non-secrecy price of 3 if there really is a card that you just don't ever want to see. It certainly is a steep price at 3, but if the card's bad enough from the encounter deck, it might be worth it. Certainly if you're using cards like Hinnemarth Riversong to look at the top card of the encounter deck so you maybe know it's coming up, or some sort of other encounter deck scrying effect. Again, as with most of the cards of this adventure pack, I've never played with it, and none of my buddies have ever used it, so I don't have any practical experience with it, but it seems on the surface that it's in a secrecy deck probably very worthwhile for the cost of 1, and a non-secrecy deck potentially worthwhile with its cost of 3.
Certainly, if players aren't running secrecy, that cost can be a little bit high to stomach, but there are certainly situations where the players are going to find themselves largely in control of the encounter deck, and just like we're going to be covering in our actual playthrough of Road to Rivendell, there are a few encounter cards that if they happen to come up, the players are essentially going to be losing the game no matter what. So effects like Sleeping Sentry that are able to just kill an incredible number of characters at once, or maybe Orc Ambush, where you're at the end of the game and then all of a sudden 10, 15, or 20 Orc enemies return to play and the players are absolutely overwhelmed. Potentially very dangerous effects could be removed from play with this. If characters aren't fond of running effects like Denethor, where they're scrying the top of the encounter deck and then essentially removing it from the game just by putting it at the bottom, where maybe it's never going to be seen, I think this can be very effective. The only problem is, if it's a card that's worth victory points that's the problem, you're out of luck. And if in those top 5 cards you end up getting things that are pretty okay for you to deal with, then this isn't really having the most useful effect. And really the only other thing about this card is that for most encounter cards, it only reduces the probability of them making an appearance. It doesn't eliminate the chance of danger altogether, unless there's maybe only a single copy. And the last thing to really take into consideration with this card is if players are running Denethor and they have put quite a few nasty cards at the bottom of the encounter deck, this does cause the encounter deck to be shuffled, so maybe that nastiness might end up a little bit closer to the top. So our final card in this adventure pack is The End Comes, a neutral event which for a cost of 0 reads Response. After a dwarf character leaves play, shuffle the encounter discard pile back into the encounter deck. So this card is very situational, and I have to admit that it's a little bit of a struggle for me to come up with a lot of creative uses for this one. So it can certainly allow players to retrieve objectives that end up in the discard pile, like Athalas or Gollum in the Dead Marshes, or like when we were playing through the Red Horn Gate and those victory point locations ended up in the discard pile. This is one way for players to kind of reintroduce that element of chance of drawing a beneficial card into the encounter deck.
Yeah, the problem there, though, is we have to have a dwarf character leave play, and then Shadow of the Past is probably a superior way to get that one particular card back. But I'm with you, Mitch. You know, I try to give the designers of this game the benefit of the doubt. I don't think they invent cards just for fun. Whoever designed this card must have had something in mind when they were creating this card, but for the life of me, I can't come up with anything that Shadow of the Past doesn't handle, and probably handle better. I'm just at a loss for words, honestly, when it comes to this card, and I don't have much to say other than this will never ever be in my decks unless there's just some quest that has some sort of broken mechanic where you can't get something that's critical to your success. Rather than beat a dead horse here, I think this is a horrible card, designer's attentions or not. I would love to ask Caleb or somebody at some point, if I ever meet them, what were you thinking, or what was FFG thinking when this card was designed, and maybe can help me understand it a little bit more.
Make sure to use that question as your icebreaker when you meet some of the devs, Gen Con 2013.
Right.
But really, apart from maybe shuffling some beneficial cards or locations like Forest Grove back into the encounter deck, really the only other use for this is maybe if you've just been seeing a ton of very gentle cards coming off of the encounter deck, you can filter a very gentle discard pile back into your deck. But really, if you're in that situation, you've probably had such an easy go of things so far that you've been able to accumulate enough resources, characters, good stuff in your hands that you can deal with some nastiness if it does come off the top of the deck. Well, now that we've covered our new hero and our 9 latest player cards, any overall thoughts on the strengths and weaknesses of this adventure pack?
Well, I think Khazad-dûm was the strongest entry into the game, outside of the core set, of course, that we've reviewed so far. I think the first 2 adventure packs of the Dwarrowdelf cycle leave a little bit to be desired. Certainly, I like the heroes of the first 2 adventure packs. And in this set, Lure of Moria and Rivendell Blade are staples, but as I mentioned in our individual reviews, most of these cards are cards I've never played with or that my play group doesn't use as well. So it probably just speaks to the sort of underwhelming nature of this adventure pack, and some great cards, but also a lot of just really not so stellar entries here into our card pool.
Just like yourself, I've certainly run my own fair share of Noldor Brothers decks, taking advantage of those 2 powerful heroes put together. I think there are a few very powerful staple cards introduced in this adventure pack. Just like you said, Lure of Moria is absolutely incredible. Things like Rivendell Blade allow characters that are losing some interest in dwarves some other potent combat options. There are a few kind of trick cards that I've used before, like Rider of the Mark and Hail of Stones, but for my own personal playstyle, everything else in this adventure pack kind of falls a little bit flat. So, in writing our reviews for this set of player cards, my opinion of these is probably a little lackluster. But I think we might as well bring this video to a close, so as always, thank you guys so much for checking out another entry in our progression series. Up next is going to be our actual scenario playthrough of Road to Rivendell. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. If you've thought of some creative uses for any of these cards that Matthew and I haven't managed to come up with, or have just so happened to slip our minds, be sure to let us know in the comments below, especially if you've got a more favorable opinion of some of these cards than either he or I do. But with that said, thanks for checking out another entry, and we'll see you again soon.